Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Sustainable Living Series presentation. Today we have Dr. Paul Grogan, and he will be discussing why we need nothing short of a complete paradigm shift to effectively address the environmental and social challenges of the Anthropocene, one that not only changes how our society and its one that not only changes how our society functions, but more fundamentally, one that overcomes several of our core genetically endowed traits. To move forward to a more sustainable society, we will undoubtedly need extraordinarily creative technological solutions. But in addition, we will also need to adopt a fundamentally different lifestyle that is aimed more at the greater good of the community and at the success of the individual or family. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Paul Grogan.
Thanks,
And
Marlo.
you can start whenever you're comfortable.
Great. Thank you very much, Marlo, for organizing this and to the Queen's Sustainability Office in general. I really appreciate it, and I hope my goal is to present a stimulating set of ideas that might be the basis for discussion. And I'm aware that you've had various kinds of presentations in this section and this series before. This one's going to be a little bit different because, as you'll see, I'm kind of a big picture guy. And the emphasis, the real focus that I want to get across here is about realism and how realism combined with compassion can be vehicles for the resilience that are going to be needed to cope with the sustainability issues that we're all going to face. I want to acknowledge that you'll notice the talk is called What Can Biology Tell Us About Our Future 5.6. And so that's because, just like computer software, this talk has evolved over time. The very first fledgling version of it I gave back in 2011 to a group of students. And over the years, I've developed it. And indeed, I've used it as a basis of teaching in some of my courses. So there are a lot of students that have contributed in to various ideas here. There are some colleagues in my department who have contributed, and there are family and friends, because as you'll see, this is quite a personal perspective that I hope will be useful to you. So who am I? I'm a prof in ecology, terrestrial ecosystem ecology. The most important thing from your perspective is that I'm just another human being grappling with the products of being conscious on a journey, trying to make sense of myself and my environment. So I've acknowledged the students and colleagues, etc. The other acknowledgement I want to make is to the land, or make a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the Haudenosaunee and then Anishinaabe people occupy the territory in which I am now living, and they have a right to that territory. And not only is it an issue of land, but of course it's an issue of exploitation of people. And I'm doing my best to make myself more and more aware of that, and to think about ways in which in some way recompense could be made. So I've got two questions today. Why are we in our current environmental situation? And I'm going to be pretty brief about that one. And then the second one is, how should we be responding to awareness of our current trajectory environmentally and socially? And in summary, I'm going to argue that human activities on Earth are almost certainly heading us towards a major population crash, and that we need nothing short of a complete paradigm shift, a complete change in the way that we live, one that not only changes how our society and its economy functions, but more fundamentally, one that overcomes several of our genetically endowed traits. To move towards a more sustainable society, we'll undoubtedly need extraordinarily creative technological solutions. They're important, no question about it. But in addition, we're also going to need to adopt a fundamentally different lifestyle that's aimed more at the greater good of the community than at the success of the individual or family. So I hope by the end, those ideas will be a bit more clear. And as Marlo said, you can post questions in the chat. I'm very happy to share these slides with people afterwards. I've got my email address up there right now, and I've got it on the last slide as well. And of course, you can ask a question at the end as well, but we'll keep all the questions to the end. But if you want to come online, you're very welcome. All right, so here we go. My first slide. Home. That planet there obviously is where we have lived and where we've evolved, and we can see it in a number of different perspectives. And the first one I want to offer is that we know that life has evolved on that planet. And we've learned a lot about the biology of how life has changed over time, the processes, the biological principles under which those patterns and changes have happened. And therefore, we should be able to, certainly me as a biologist, use some of those principles to predict what the future might be like. And so that's one essence of it. The second is that it's a sealed system. Basically, there's energy arriving at the surface. There's some energy being bounced back. But in terms of the nutrients, the elements, the carbon, the hydrogen, the nitrogen, etc., they're pretty much sealed within that system. Nothing is added, nothing is taken away. And it's an island in another sense. I want to share with you a little sort of imaginary perspective on an island. Imagine a small island in a lake, maybe out in Lake Ontario, on which maize and other seed-bearing plants are the dominant vegetation. Imagine that there were no animals on this island until one day an old barrel containing several mice drifts from the mainland onto the shoreline. The mice disembark and soon find themselves in a land of plenty. They feed, they grow, they survive, they reproduce. Fundamental biological traits. The mouse population rapidly increases over the years, albeit with occasional diepacks, perhaps due to harsh winters or disease outbreaks. But at some point, it's almost certain that the mouse population will grow to a size where it begins to exceed the rate of food production. At this stage, those individuals that are stronger, more competitive, and more reproductively active will tend to dominate the gene pool. The weaker will tend to die off first. That's evolution by natural selection. Nevertheless, if almost all the seeds are being consumed, there'll be little left to provide the basis for plant growth the following year. And so even the more competitive or best adapted mice will begin to die off. The mouse population crash is essential for the long-term viability of the system. Whatever seeds that remain during the crash have a much better chance of surviving to germinate, grow, and reproduce in subsequent years, eventually renewing the food resource for the surviving mice. My point with this simple analogy is that cycles of population rises and falls are typical of any species. It's a basic biological pattern. And therefore, these same fundamental drivers also apply to our own species. So with that analogy in mind, let me give you my take-home messages. This is a classic teaching technique. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you've told them. So in essence, this talk is about realism and connections to compassion. The question, how ought I to live, is so fundamental for each and every one of us. In fact, it's one of the most basic questions in philosophy. And I'm going to approach it from three different angles, as it were. I'm going to talk about the global change sustainability crises that we're currently enduring. I'm going to put those in the context of the fundamentals of biology, those principles I outlined even with that mouse island analogy, evolution, population cycles, those kinds of things. And the third prong to the triangle in terms of plotting or moving ahead in terms of deciding how we ought to live is about reflective, mindful awareness and realism, acknowledging the realism of situations. And so I'm going to blend those three together to address that central question. So here's the first gloomy graph, and there are some gloomy perspectives in here, but I also think I balanced them with some more realistic perspectives that are positive. So this is a slide that I use in my teaching. I've used it in 2020, 2021, and 2022, and I've just literally superscript out the lines that strike through the lines that don't apply anymore. So this graph is from, as you can see, it is from 2022, and we're looking at the global mean temperature as against a mean from 1951 to 1980. And so you can see that in general, in the early 1900s, temperatures were relatively cooler on average, and that more recently temperatures have begun to rise. But the real kicker, of course, is that back in 2020, I was able to say the last 7 years have been the warmest 7 years on record. In 2021, I was able to say the last 8 years have been the warmest 8 years on record. And just recently, I was able to say the last 9 years have been the warmest 9 years on record. Things are not good. And here's a quote from the COP27 meeting that happened in Egypt in 2022 from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. We're in a fight of our lives and we're losing. We are on a highway to hell, a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. It's that significant. And that's just climate change. Here's another graph to illustrate some of the more general impacts that have happened in biology, in the oceans, on kelp forests, etc. And you don't have to look at the detail here. Red means damaged or lost or affected in some way, the proportion of the Earth's surface in the top line. And blue means intact or remaining or unaffected. So terrestrial biodiversity, there's a certain proportion, about 20%, that we think is damaged or lost or affected, 80% not. Wild mammals, different kind of pattern, 70 or 80% are seriously affected, very few are not. So this is just another, and I could show many slides to demonstrate that we really are facing an environmental sustainability crisis at multiple levels. But it's important to remember that sustainability is not just about the environment. Here's a photo from Kingston, a photo from Northern Ontario, and a photo from Calcutta. 1 in 10 people around the world are living below the poverty line. And that number is about 1 in 10 in Kingston, by the way. Now, without these people being part of the sustainability movement forward, we cannot achieve sustainability. In other words, if you and I are living a particularly sustainable life, that's great. But with so many people still living below the poverty line, we need to bring them above the poverty line and allow them to contribute in positive ways too. At the moment, of course, they're literally living from hand to mouth. Their struggles are about where they find the next meal. So we can't expect them to engage in these kinds of issues. But those of us who are more privileged certainly have a responsibility, I think. And that's the current situation, but it's worth pointing out that things are actually getting worse. The widening economic, gender, and racial inequalities are tearing our world apart, according to a recent Oxfam report. The 10 richest men in the world own more than the bottom 3.1 billion people. There's about 7.8 billion people on the planet at the moment. So the 10 richest men in the world own more than almost half of the poorest. And furthermore, that pattern has been increasing. And the top 1% are capturing more and more, and the bottom 50% less and less. So the divide is growing. So I'm going to make 4 points here that I think help to illustrate where we're at and why we're where we're at. The first is that we're an extraordinary species. Homo sapiens, wise man or wise human. We've produced great works of art, is just one example. Great works of literature, great works of philosophy. Just a quick section or sample. But having said that, you and I, or I'll just talk about me, spend a lot of my life running around like a headless chicken. Buzz, 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 trying to do more and more and more. Here's an illustration from Black Friday where you got people competing to get cheap TVs and that kind of thing. Here's a lady who's obviously experiencing anxiety. So are we really Homo sapiens? Or would Homo insanus be a better description of the way that you and I, those of us who are more privileged in this world, tend to live, let alone the poor, of course, is a different story. The second point to remember is where we've come from. You and I, and almost every other organism that you can see around you, has evolved from single-celled organisms like bacteria. And as that evolution has happened, from animals that learn to fight and compete, just like bacteria fight and compete, animals that learn to store food, to get over the winter. There's all kinds of traits that have evolved that we also have, that are hardwired into our DNA for competition, for resource accumulation, as well as obviously for reproduction, etc., etc., etc. That's my point. We carry core-based genetic traits because we are another species. We're not just another species, but we are another species. In addition to that, of course, we carry some pretty sophisticated traits. Here's a bunch of people, you may not be able to see this very clearly, all looking at their phones, distracting themselves in one way or another, perhaps. And here's a nice illustration again of a cinema movie house. And there's two movies showing. Some of you may know the film An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, about the climate crisis that was launched maybe 15 or 20 years ago. But of course, the joke is, or the reality is, that most people are choosing not to go to that one. They'd rather go to The Reassuring Lie. And I think we can all think of examples of that kind of perspective perpetuating itself into the current day. And then we've evolved traits for self, to see ourselves as separate from nature. A delusion, but certainly one that's very powerful. And right at the tip, ego, this idea of our own self-importance. But the key point here is that, yes, we've got some advanced traits, and there are many reasons why we've got these traits, including presumably genetically endowed traits for escapism and denial. But we've also got a whole set of core fundamental traits that reflect our evolutionary origins for growth, for resource accumulation, for competition, etc. Okay, so the third point I want to make is my first image, a spinning wheel. I've shown you the triangle already. Here's the spinning wheel. And this is one way, an unnervingly simple way of understanding sustainability. So on the left side here, we've got resources, the various resources that we need, and there's just a few of them here: fertile soil, water, minerals, etc. And as we use those resources, wastes are produced on the right side: sewage, polluted water, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, etc. And so the idea is that with human activities, this wheel spins, using resources, producing wastes. And for us to live completely sustainability, the rate at which these resources are being used and converted to wastes needs to be matched by the rate of regeneration of those wastes back into resources. A tall order. And in the context of how society has evolved over the last certainly 200 or 300 years since the Industrial Revolution, it's useful to think of two factors that influence this overall sustainability perspective. First is the rate at which the wheel is spinning, which might represent, if you like, the intensity with which we live life. My grandparents were not flying around the world. I do. That obviously uses all kinds of resources. I use a lot more resources than them in terms of food, in terms of fuel, in terms of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the rate at which we use resources has increased greatly. And the second factor is the thickness of this spinning wheel. It's depicted here relatively thinly, but obviously the more humans are, the greater the population, the more the flow of resources into waste. So we can illustrate it like this, where we've got a thicker growing population, in other words, now almost 8 billion, and then turning relatively quickly. And so this is unnervingly simple, but it's hard to argue with. There are the facts. That's the reality. And there's our mice back on the island to illustrate the same basic perspective. The mice were using resources, growing in size, producing more and more waste. Eventually, the resources reach a critical point and there's a crash in the population. No different for the island on my left, on your left. Okay, so that's the third one. And then the fourth one allows me to introduce the second sort of major diagram in this talk. And it's about the idea that, yeah, we've got an environmental crisis, but it's only part of our predicament. Humanity faces many interrelated problems, and many of them share the same fundamental biological root cause. which is how we choose to live. So let me illustrate what I mean by that with a tree. So here's the tree. And in this particular case, you can see that one of the leaves is representing disease. That's one problem. We've obviously had a big problem with COVID-19 in the last few years. That's one particular virus, obviously. That's a problem humanity faces. There are others, antibiotic resistance, etc. But there are many other leaves on the tree too. Climate change is a very obvious one that we've talked about already. Land use change, even bigger than climate change in terms of its impacts on the planet, deforestation, biodiversity loss, etc. And here's some more leaves, all of which are categorized within the environmental category. Loss of coral reefs, loss of other habitats, invasive species, freshwater pollution and extraction, lots of different environmental related problems that humanity faces. Climate change is a very significant one, but it really is the tip of the iceberg, if you'll pardon the pun. And then there's a second set of problems about personal well-being. We're aware of these, but we don't quite talk about them in the same context. So mental health issues, for example, drug abuse. 2 people in BC die every day from fentanyl abuse. Care of the elderly, screen time, those kinds of things, personal safety. And there's a third category of problems, more leaves, in other words, with a slightly different shade of green. Here's just one of them, industrialized food production. And note that these problems are linked. So we deforest the land to produce more food for industrialized food production, and the quality of that food often leads to preventable physical health issues, like diabetes, for example, in some instances. So these problems are not just big on their own, but they're interlinked, they interact with each other. And there are many examples of interactions that we could draw on. So what else on the socioeconomic and political side? Global migration, a huge issue. Not such a big issue in Canada, perhaps, but obviously in other parts of the world, in Europe, and on the border with the United States in the south, a huge problem and growing. And here's some more. Decolonization, indigenous rights, food insecurity, fake news, future energy supply. The rich-poor imbalance that I mentioned is growing. Inequality and intolerance along poverty lines, along racial lines, along gender lines, along disability lines. So the point of this diagram and characterizing a lot of these different kinds of problems is to illustrate that they are leaves on a tree, and it's the hardwood of the tree that's producing those leaves. So what is it that's the common factors linking all these problems? I think you can argue quite clearly that it's the combination of genes and our culture and our history. In other words, human behavior, how we choose to live, is creating a lot of these problems. So, accepting that as the reality, and of course we all do, and then we get concerned, and then we put our heads back in the sand because we may have traits, genetically endowed traits, to stop ourselves from getting too gloomy, as it were. But the hope is, and hope I use with a very guarded sense, as you'll see in a few minutes, the hope is that recognizing and acknowledging those 4 realizations, the fact that cycles of populations rise and fall, the spinning wheel idea, the tree idea, that human behavior is at the root of our issues. The hope is that by fully acknowledging those, we can catalyze or give rise to some kind of paradigm shift, which would lead to a more sustainable and wiser way of living. So I think the best way of representing that is to take a cosmological perspective. You are here. Awareness. All organisms, all animals at least, have some, and plants, have some element of awareness, but obviously humans, our particular species, has a particularly advanced ability to be consciously aware of our environment, of our own actions, and of ourselves. We can look down from above. I can imagine in my mind's eye, Paul Grogan looking at a screen, talking on Zoom right now, and you all have the same capacity. Here we are, sitting on the edge of a planet, spinning around in the middle of nowhere. We're aware of that. That's an extraordinarily powerful realization. I'll get back to it. So just to show how, and there's a lot of text on this slide, but just if the main point really is that awareness, that ability to use our consciousness, our conscience, has resulted in major positive change. So I've been quite gloomy up till now in some senses, but there are some ways in which we are clearly progressing as a society. The civil rights movement is an example. Women's rights, indigenization, equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and anti-racism, restorative justice. These are all buzzwords, and rightly so, because they're really important, positive advances that we're making as a society. We're not there by any means, but at least we're talking about it. And as somebody who came to Canada 20 years ago, it's been remarkable to me to observe and see just how much our awareness of the indigenization issue in Canada and the history of colonization and its impacts, the awareness of that has grown dramatically. Awareness is not solving the problem, but at least it's the first step towards acknowledging that there is a problem and then thinking about ways in which it can be repaired. So that's the positive slide. Don't forget that one. Okay, so what can you and I do to help us move toward being Homo sapiens, wiser humans, towards more sustainable living? And in your series, in the sustainability series from Queen's, some of these things have been covered, I know, and some of them are very obvious. But let me just highlight a couple. There's the 4R. So everybody knows about reduce, reuse, recycle. And it's really important to emphasize that recycling is good. Reusing is 10 or 100 times better than recycling. Reducing is 10 or 100 times better than reusing. And the 4th R, the one that people don't think about quite so much, is resist, which is even better, even more powerful. Resisting consumerism, resisting the wasteful use of resources, etc., etc. So there's lots of things there, but they're pretty obvious. I'll just point out alarm bell words. When you hear in your own mind, you're saying, I'd like more of that, or I'd like to be successful. When you hear that word more, just be aware that that's the classic behavioral characteristic of any organism, accumulating more resources to help in its growth, survival, and reproduction. And so there probably is a genetic element to that behavior. Genes don't bark, but when it comes to human behavior, they do whisper. And there probably are genetically endowed features that give rise to those kinds of behavior. We can be aware of it, as I said, we're conscious, and that can be really powerful in terms of potentially modifying our behavior. So that's the first order change, which basically is about things that we can do right now and that we are doing to refine our current way of living, to improve it, in other words, to address some of the sustainability issues we've got. But here's some realism. There was an IPCC report, the International Panel on Climate Change, just a couple of weeks ago, and this is from March 27th or so. And in essence, in summary, it's the final warning. It's saying this is society's final warning that if we don't do something significant about CO2 emissions, we really are going to live in a much warmer world. And this is a projection of just how much warmer it'll be if you were born in 2020, etc. In that same week, the Biden administration approved the opening of a major oil petroleum reserve in the high Arctic, which obviously is going to release, its use is going to release large amounts of CO2 in burning fossil fuel. There's that cognitive dissonance. And so we face a problem, and it's very clear that simply first order change, refining our current way of living, is not going to be sufficient and is not going to be fast enough, but certainly, maybe more importantly, it's not going to be sufficient to really change our trajectory as a society. We need second order change. That means structural change in the way that we live, around a fundamentally different set of values about what we think is most important, and maybe perhaps I would suggest strongly prioritizing social and ecological values over economic ones. Economics matter, don't get me wrong, I fully understand that, but it shouldn't be the first priority. Perhaps the others should be. So I'm going to outline now ways in which that second order change might be promoted. What can you and I do to be more aware of second order change? And there's two basic components to it. One is literally embracing those big picture realities, rejecting myths and delusions. We live by myths and delusions. We live as a society by the idea that we can have perpetual economic growth. Perpetual economic growth simply is a dream, a delusion. And yet that's how elections generally go in democracies, let alone in other political systems. And there are many other myths and delusions that we live by, including our own notion of being immortal, etc., etc. So here's a sort of a catch-all slide. Our fundamental biology, there are realities associated with that we carry, not just base traits for competition, greed, etc., but also more advanced traits around consciousness, and that these traits may be our way of advancing our perspective on how we ought to live, going back to that triangle that I mentioned right at the start. The second fundamental biological principle is that there are populations, and populations rise and fall depending on resource availability. That's how it is for every other species. And as I said, we're certainly a special species, but we're still a species bounded by the same basic biological principles. So we should expect that there will be a crash. And maybe we should be thinking more about how we can soften the impact of that crash rather than deluding ourselves that it simply won't happen. There are other realities too. The notion of impermanence, the mortal self. We're aware of it, but we don't really live like it, I would suggest. And maybe I'll just talk about myself. Yeah, sure, I can look around the room and think, well, that person won't be around forever, but I don't really live myself consciously aware on a regular basis that this could be my last day. I might be better off if I did. Impermanence also applies to species. We know from biology, species evolve and appear, and then species go extinct. Far more species have gone extinct than currently occur today. In other words, that's the general pattern. There's no reason why Homo sapiens would be any different. We can also expect that our environment will change in all kinds of ways. And yet we live with this idea. When you hear the word permanent, that's an alarm bell. That's a delusion. Nothing is permanent. So that's impermanence. The other one, of course, as an ecologist, but it applies much larger than that, is the idea of interconnectedness. We are extraordinarily interconnected with each other, with other species, and with the environment. And we are interdependent. Really, really embracing that, rather than tending towards the self idea, would really result in a change in the way we live. And finally, this notion of suffering. So I know that I suffer, but it would really help in terms of a universalism, a sense of a fellow compassion, if we are aware that all human beings suffer. Every single person listening to this Zoom talk is suffering in some way or other. Some have suffered more than others, that's for sure. Some are less lucky, as it were. But we all suffer. In fact, I love that quote. The mind is obsessed with the potential for trouble. That's from Pema Chodron. But that idea that if we're not suffering, we're going to find some way to suffer. Our minds are obsessed with it. Recognizing that and dealing with it by leaning into that suffering in various different ways could be much more productive than evading or avoiding or escaping it. So there's the big picture realities, and embracing those would really help us, I think, to promote that paradigm shift I'm talking about towards a fundamental different way of living. The second set of practices is rather a long list, and I'll just put them up fairly quickly. So these are various ideas that we could use to not just embrace the realities, that's one thing, but to enhance that capacity of our consciousness to look down from above, to see ourselves in our environment, and as a result of that, to suppress some of those more base genetic traits. Slowing down, making time for reflection, paying attention. These are things that are becoming more common, but we all could do an awful lot more of, I suspect. Being skeptical of anthropocentric perspectives that result in commodification, exploitation of natural and human resources. Being skeptical, queering, anthropocentric, the idea that resources are there for our use, is an extraordinarily arrogant and anthropocentric perspective. Indigenous people have quite a different perspective on that, and we could learn a lot from them. I'll just flip through a few of these just to go fairly quickly. Immersing yourself in nature. That's a way of making our consciousness more aware. I spent yesterday afternoon up at Frontenac Park, and I sat down near a wetland and heard the spring peepers, and my goodness, did they sing. That's a wonderful thing to be able to be aware of. But it also is in some way a connection, or enhancing a sense of connection. And last but not least, maybe perhaps the most important one in my mind, striving for the combination of both compassion, wanting to relieve the suffering of yourself and others, and wisdom, in other words, doing the right thing in how we treat ourselves, in how we treat each other, in how we treat other species, and finally, in how we treat our environment. Trying to do some of these things, I argue, would help us enhance the capacity of our consciousness to suppress some of those more base genetic traits for competition, for resource accumulation, and result in a more sustainable and perhaps wiser, and perhaps I would argue more contented life. So together, the idea is that those things would tend to put a brake, that increased awareness, would put a brake on this wheel and maybe move us toward more sustainable living. Note, I'm not saying achieving more sustainable living, because I would argue that that's probably a myth, but we can certainly move towards more sustainable living and maybe, as I said, more contented living. So let me come towards the end here by just addressing some of the key issues in terms of how we perceive sustainability. And I've got an image here of Greta Thunberg, and of course she's had a huge impact. And I and many others participated in marches a couple of years ago, pre-COVID obviously, to promote the idea that young people and many people were very supportive of the idea that the international community should cut fossil fuel emissions by 50% by 2030, by 100% by 2050, in order to keep the climate warming, just one problem, to keep climate warming below 1.5 degrees around the Earth. And there was a lot of hope associated with that. But of course, we're now 7 years away from 2030. And I wonder how we'll feel when we get to 2030, and it's extremely unlikely that we'll have made any significant impact in terms of reducing fossil fuel emissions. As it is, fossil fuel emissions continue to rise at a very steady rate. Even through COVID, there was only a 7% decline in the major COVID year, but emissions have caught up again, et cetera, et cetera. So my real point is here that hope is a rather dangerous word in some ways, or concept, because the opposite of hope is despair. And despair obviously also has its dangers. And there are various people who have written some really beautiful writings on hope as an obstacle. Thich Nhat Hanh would argue that hope basically we tend to use hope in the idea of transferring responsibility. I hope the government will do something about this. I hope the university will do something about this, etc., rather than on the self and things that you and I can do. Furthermore, hope can be then transjected or pushed into the future. I hope that this will happen by 2030, when the only thing we can actually do anything about is right now. So there are issues there about hope, and it can be seen as an obstacle, as he described. And then there's Joanna Macy, a beautiful writer, and she talks about active hope and the idea that the notion that one could try in one's behavior to choose to do the right thing. How you decide that is another issue, and we can talk about that afterwards perhaps. But doing the right thing regardless of anticipated outcome. So in other words, continuing to resist, reduce, reuse, etc., despite the fact that it's unlikely we will meet that desire to reduce fossil fuel emissions by 50% by 2030, etc. But continue to do it, to do the right thing, without attachment to outcome, without concern about the anticipated outcome. It may or may not happen the way you'd like it, but you're still going to go ahead and do the right thing anyway. I think that's a very powerful perspective. So that leads me to this idea that, okay, you got this a seesaw, as it were, and despair is on one side and hope is on the other. And that if you experience hope, then you're potentially going to experience despair as well. And of course, we all do in multiple ways in our lives, not just with regard to climate change, etc., but multiple aspects of our life. And that the sweet point is really in the middle. And that's around realism. It's about being practical and pragmatic and realistic about what the potential future might hold and how to react towards it. And one way of thinking about this is the glass. Is the glass half empty or is it half full? Well, another way of thinking about this is that half the internal volume of the glass contains water. That realistic perspective may be, I would argue, is much more beneficial to us in our individual lives and in thinking about global change. So I'm going to return now and just outline those take-home messages again, just so that they're clear. So we talked about the global change sustainability crises and the spinning wheel, for example, and the inevitability that we would get to this situation that we're in now. We're a population, we're growing, we're using resources, we have intelligence, etc., etc., etc. And so therefore, it's highly likely that our population will get to the point where resources begin to run out and wastes begin to accumulate. And of course, one of those wastes is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So most people have a pretty good handle on that. We've just finished a global change biology course in which some new perspectives came out in terms of how global change issues, we tend to think about, categorize them separately, but of course they interact. Climate change affects biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss affects carbon accumulation in forests, etc., etc. So that's one point on the triangle. The second point is about those fundamentals of biology. This is the core, things that we know. We know that we've evolved. We know how we've evolved in broad terms. We know that it's highly likely that we carry some genes that influence our behavior, genes that are associated with competition, with resource accumulation, and ultimately then with population growth because of reproduction, etc. We also know from fundamentals of biology that all populations rise and fall depending on the use of resources, resources running out, wastes accumulating. And so we can expect nothing else for our own population. We are not separate from nature. We are an intrinsic part of nature. And the third angle, perhaps the more distinctive one, or most distinctive one, is this idea that our consciousness, which is also an evolved trait, may allow us to at least be aware and acknowledge the impact that we're having on the environment, the impact that we're having on other people around us. And that being aware of those things provides us with the capacity for realism, keeps us maybe on a more steady keel, as it were, on that seesaw towards the center. And that those perspectives will be really useful, not just in terms of addressing sustainability issues, by reducing, by living a less intense lifestyle, etc., as I've kind of outlined briefly, but also in terms of coping mentally with the changes that are likely to come. And I'd argue that one of the key factors triggering, if you like, a greater sense of reflective, mindful awareness and realism, is a perspective on gratitude. And this is one that is quite common and widespread in certain cultures, indigenous cultures, for example, being grateful. I can sit there and listen to those peepers in that wetland spring and be grateful that all those things have happened which have allowed me to sit on that rock and hear those sounds and enjoy that spectacle. That's a different perspective than thinking of nature as a resource that we can use. And it has profound impacts, I think. So I'm going to stop there. I'll leave you with this quote from Albert Einstein that I think is really powerful and exemplifies a lot of what I've said. So I'm going to read it. A human being is a part of the whole that we call the universe, a part limited in space and time. He or she experiences himself or herself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. I hope you can see the direct connection to some of the things I've talked about earlier. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few people near us. Our task, given that we have this trait for consciousness, must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And I would argue, just to finish, that doing so would not only result in living more sustainable lifestyles, but would also help us to cope with the changes that we are experiencing and are going to experience. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Wow, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. So yeah, anyone feel free to ask questions in the chat, or if you want to put your mic on and your camera on, you can also directly ask. Lots of thumbs ups and claps.
I'm very happy to take questions of any nature on the talk or others if.
Oh, Michelle has a question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, this is a new computer for me, so I'm just figuring it out. Thank you so much for this, Paul. It's a really captivating presentation. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the fact that our economy is very built off of constant creation, like constantly creating new widgets, new things. We've created an economy that's based off of just making more. And if you kind of have any thoughts or ideas, or I guess just any kind of insight maybe on where you see like the need for businesses in either specific examples or more general sense, to, I guess, kind of start shifting their attention to move away from this kind of widget creation economy into a more sustainable way of moving forward and still being able to create a sustainable economy. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks, Michelle. I mean, I first of all, I realize that the economy is very important, and so what I'm really trying to argue for is that a reprioritization of our values, so that the economy is not the number one thing, is not just desirable but actually essential. So that's the first point. The second one is that, in terms of widgets and technology, there's this concept called the progress trap, which I'm not sure you're familiar with, but the idea that we've got this intelligence, we've been able to come up with all kinds of technologies which have solved problems. Maybe the classic one is the plow. So before the plow, producing food in fields was hard work by hand. And then, of course, the plow, driven first by by horses and etc., was a great way of improving turnover of the soil, making it more fertile, producing more food. So that solved that problem. But the issue then, of course, is that that produced more food, which allowed the population to grow, and now we've got a larger problem. Another example might be the internal combustion engine. Fantastic solution technologically to the issue of mobility. Before that, of course, people moved around in horses and carts, and that was about it, right? And with the steam engines. And so the internal combustion engine has been wonderful in terms of addressing that problem, but of course has now launched us into an even larger problem of fossil fuels and fossil fuel emissions and that kind of thing. So even being aware of that kind of perspective can help us. And when new technologies come along, I think in the past, people have tended to assume that whenever there's a problem, we can solve it by some further new technology. And that's one of the points that I think has become very clear in the last 20 years is actually a lot of the technologies have got us into the problem. And so backing off from them will help us to reduce them. So there's a very broad answer. There are examples of companies and institutions that have taken a more sustainable perspective. One I can think of off the top of my head is Patagonia, the clothing manufacturer, which I gather has a very sustainably oriented perspective. The bottom line is we need to stop this urge, which again, I would argue is genetically driven, for more and more growth. Because more and more growth means the desire for more and more profit, and ultimately that's untenable. And we're all a part of it. I'm part of a pension fund at Queen's, for example, which invests in various companies that require growth over the years to fulfill those pension needs. So we all need to back off, as it were. It's a complex one.
I think Peter was next. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Thank you, Paul. That was a wonderful talk, and I think echoed many of the ideas I've had, although I've never been quite so eloquent as you.
Thanks,
I wish I could be. Your talk started and ended effectively with the fundamental problem of too many people consuming too many resources and producing too much waste. And I wonder if you, given the way society works and what you've just said just a few moments ago about economic growth, whether there's any value in actually trying to define what the carrying capacity of the earth would be for human beings living in a certain lifestyle, and whether you ever think that we will see public policy emerge to encourage a reduction in population size and a reduction in economic growth rates.
Yeah, so the first point I'd make in thanks, Peter. The first point I'd make in response to that is the notion that population size is definitely a problem, and there's certainly a lot of debate in the popular media about just how important population size is. But for me, as I've outlined, it's critical in terms of the thickness of that spinning wheel idea. However, it is true to say that population is likely to peak, as so far as we can tell, at something like 9 billion or thereabouts by the end of this century, and then it's projected to decline for a variety of reasons. Whether that'll turn out to be true or not, we'll see. But more important than that is the idea that if you take from 1900 to 2000, the global population increased by a factor of 4. So 2 billion to almost 8 billion or thereabouts. GDP, which might be thought of as an indicator of resource use intensity, in other words, the speed of that spinning wheel, that grew from 1900 to 2000 by a factor of 40. So in other words, population size is a problem, but a much, much bigger problem is the fact that as we go through successive generations, each one is using more and more resources per person. And of course, as development happens and people who are coming out of poverty have the capacity to buy washing machines and cars, which is quite very much their right, that's just going to exacerbate that more. But the resource use intensity is probably the key factor, the most sensitive factor that we could adjust in terms of putting us on a more sustainable pathway. And so then that comes down to, well, yes, there could be government directives, etc. But really, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that we individuals have and can make choices too that reduce our resource use intensity and therefore contribute to at least addressing the problem, if you follow me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
And Anya?
Thanks, Paul. This was really amazing.
Thank you.
I think your last point speaks partially to what I initially commented on in the chat, is when we talk about so many people living below the poverty line and the need to bring them up. I actually would argue that we really need to bring those very few people that have so much in this world and that, you know, are certainly controlling a lot and in many ways, that we need to bring them down, because like you say, if we're bringing up the poverty line, and not to say that we shouldn't, we're getting into this wheel of we all need a car, we all need a washing machine, we all need all these gadgets, when really we should be bringing down and cracking down on some of the crazy earnings that some very few people in the world do. So that sort of would be one of my points. Having grown up in Eastern Germany, where there was no growth whatsoever, as a young child, I have a good sense of what it is that you go to the store truly only for the few things that you have. There is no more, there's more wishing, but there's nothing there. I sometimes look back at this time and think this was a much nicer way to live, simply because you didn't have to make any choices, but you were just as happy because you didn't know any better. But my question to you would be, getting involved in community in order to make some change. I get very, I'm on the despair end of the teeter-totter, and I sometimes wonder is, if getting involved in community, I'm starting to feel like it's not enough, and it's not reaching the level of change that I'd like to see if someone like Biden, who then goes in and drills in the Arctic for oil. And so while I'm out there gardening away in my very organic soil and my beautiful tomatoes, if there's policies being pushed through all levels of government that allow Monsanto to do certain awful things, I feel like my impact, as much as I want to do what I can, is so it might satisfy me, but it will not be enough for my kids, or for that matter, for my province. And so I don't know if you have any comments on how I cannot be desperate about, you know, or despair about getting involved in community and still feel like I have an impact.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. Thanks for both those points, which are really at the heart, actually, of some of the things that I was trying to say. So first of all, the idea of the rich-poor divide and the fact that it's growing. And I put in a quick slide there from Oxfam, the Oxfam 22 report, basically showing that it's growing. And, you know, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. The proportion of people in poverty is increasing, and the wealthy group is getting richer much, much more rapidly. So one of the issues that comes out of that, in terms of, yes, raising the people above the poverty line, we'd all like to see that happen. The part that people don't like so much is that for that to happen, people like me need to be allow our resource base to drop. And there are hardwired, genetically endowed reasons why part of me is not happy with that idea, right? And I assume that you're no different at that level, do you know? So but being aware of it is something, but I think as a society, we have a problem if we really recognizing the fact that there's a behavior within me in that context which says, okay, sure, I want it, but I'm not prepared to go poorer myself. And I've got kids or whatever, and all those kinds of things, right? If one can recognize, hold on a second, that's my genes influencing my behavior. There's a genetic element in there. In the case of kids, I want to be able to sure I can pass on resources to my kids, and etc. And there's a good reason for that, because then my genes go on to the next generation, etc. So there's hardcore biology here. But the idea is that maybe by at least being aware and acknowledging and talking about these things, we might be more willing to say, you know what, it's the right thing. You know, And even though at a base level, it's not quite comfortable for me to do this, there are other reasons why it's a good idea. So that's the answer, or at least a response to your, it's not the answer, it's the response to your first thought. The second one, that's the idea that we're all trying to do something and it's not having much of an impact, and what's the point, and that kind of thing. And that's where I would cite Joanna Macy in particular, but her ideas are quite common in certain cultures. The idea of doing the right thing without attachment to outcome is a very powerful idea, I think. And again, it's the same kind of mechanism, doing the right thing, but knowing that it's very unlikely that it's going to make a significant difference, right? So why would I do it then? What's the point? And it might be that, at a higher level, one can think about it and say, well, you know what? This is not going to work. We're not going to cut fossil fuel emissions by 50% by 2030. I really don't think we will, or whatever. That's my rational side. But my conscious side might say, well, all I can do is what I can do. And therefore, I'm going to do the best I can to reduce my emissions in one way or another. Do you know? And so the analogy that she has, it refers to Buddhist monks in Tibet, which, as you know, was colonized by China and taken over, and Buddhism was basically wiped out. And she observed monks, all the monasteries were knocked over, and she observed the monks rebuilding brick by brick the monastery. And they know, or at least they have a fair idea, that it's likely that the monastery will get knocked down again. But nevertheless, they're doing the right thing. They're trying, as it were, do you know? And it comes down to the individual, Anya, I think. I mean, there's only so much. I can't influence what happens in the Canadian government, etc. But I can influence what I do here and now. That's the thing that I've got most control over. And so therefore, the decisions that I make should be, or might be, best based on trying to do the right thing, regardless of the attachment to outcome. The analogy, if I can go on, is caring for somebody who's terminally ill. You know what the end result is going to be. At one level, it's not going to make one difference how you do it or how you handle that person or not. But at another level, of course, it has a value. And that value is to the person, perhaps, but it's also to you as the caregiver. Do you know? Thanks for the questions.
And I think that wraps up today. If anyone has any more questions, you can always email me or Dr. Grogan, who's got his email on the slide. And if you want to watch it back, it'll be posted on Sustainable Queens. And if there isn't any other questions, thank you so much, Paul. That was awesome. And all the questions. Yeah, enjoy your sunny day and weekend.
Thanks, Marlo. Thank you very much. And if anybody wants the slides, just send me an email and I can pass them on.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Thank you for joining me.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thanks.
Thanks.